Thing. Maybe now I'm seeing something moving a little bit more. Is that better? Okay, fabulous. Apologies, people. The only thing that you missed, if you were online, is that I'm trying to present some statements just to get us to reflect about our assumptions and categories about sexuality that can be culturally specific and different in different cultures. So the next one I'm going to present to you is you can be a man who likes men and still have children with a woman. Is that a thing? Do we agree? If you have had partners of the opposite gender, you're probably not straight. So this would be our category as sexual activity as opposed to sexual identity. Once you sleep with someone of the same gender, you can't be straight anymore. How rigid are our categories of sexuality and our expectations of how some categories of people behave? This is a tricky one. Only the passive partner in men-loving men relationships is gay. Is that something we believe? Is that something that we don't believe? Sex only counts as sex if a penis is involved. Something to reflect on. And I was hoping to kind of provoke a bit of thought there, because we're going to discuss what a society expects from a person in terms of their sexual identity, their sexual behavior, and also different expectations for different genders. So when we talk about heteronormativity, I've pulled some definitions of the concept. Is generally the expectation that you will have attraction for the opposite gender and form relationships specifically with the opposite gender, and then that's the natural course of people's sexuality. When we look at ancient Greek culture and ancient Roman culture, we almost want to talk about binormativity, where it was sort of expected and seen as perfectly natural happenstance, as in natural, as in instinctual reality of the feelings of sexual feelings, that they could be directed. We're talking about men specifically, and I'm gonna go into that a bit more, that you might have attractions to the same gender or the opposite gender in different situations, and sometimes even certain social rules and expectations required certain behaviors of people. So again, we want to look at this mindset that might be quite different from what we expect in our society. So the Greeks and the Romans had examples of bisexual men in their cultural stories that are very prominent. And I put here probably the most famous hero for Greece, and for the Romans he was incredibly important too, Hercules or Heracles. He had female lovers, notably 50 daughters of King Thespius in one night, but also male lovers like Hylas and Iolaus, and Iolaus was his companion in many adventures as well. Apollo, the god Apollo, had both, I put his most two famous female love interests. They were all pretty tragic, Apollo's lovers. They all pretty much died or rejected him. But also Hyacinthus and Admetus. Hyacinthus, who then becomes a beautiful flower. So again, we see gods, male gods, having love affairs with both genders. And there's not a commentary on that. It's just where love draws you. One time draws you one way, one time it draws you the other way. And it's kind of unpredictable and wild and uncontrollable. Same with Zeus. He's very famous for having many, I couldn't fit them on my board, female lovers. However, also the youth Ganymede, he not only falls in love with him, but elevates him to be the cupbearer of the gods. And his wife is very, very jealous of the boy Ganymede because he gets a permanent place in Olympus. So this is just to say, the Greeks put these type of stories in their own cultural and religious beliefs, and that is a factor we want to take into consideration when we discuss what their perception of their sexuality was in their society. So I'm going to go now through some famous stories and examples of other heroes. Achilles and Patroclus. This is a quote from Achilles. This is what he says to his companion Patroclus. I wish the Trojans death to a man, and to the Greeks too. And then we too might survive the ruins to take Troy's holy diadem. So at this point, they're in the Trojan War. They've been trying to conquer the city of Troy for 10 long years. And Achilles has kind of this fantasy of just him and Patroclus being alone and conquering the world together and being the only one left. He doesn't want any Greeks, he doesn't want any Trojans, just him and Patroclus conquering the world. So here, this is a kind of modern take on ancient art. Patroclus in the Iliad, in the epic poem, he's described as Achilles' companion. They share a tent, they grew up together, they've lived all their life together, and when they die, they're buried in the same urn, so their ashes are mixed actually together. They have very different personalities. Patroclus is the mild one, the wiser one, the more temperate. He's very empathetic, which is not Achilles. Achilles is a bit of a rage-killing machine who has strong emotions, kind of dominated by his rage. And Patroclus dies actually trying to defend the Greeks, which Achilles has abandoned because they have sort of offended him. And Patroclus can't bear to see all their companions die, so he goes into battle, dies. And Achilles, who was the greatest of the Greek warriors, basically, once Patroclus dies, there's nothing to hold him back. He really just wants to kill Hector, the Trojan who has murdered Patroclus. Initially, it's ironic because initially Achilles had abandoned the fighting, saying, well, what have the Trojans ever done to me? I'm fine. I don't have to conquer their city. But now that they have killed Patroclus, he can't hold himself back. And the grief that Achilles has for Patroclus is extreme. He honors him in his death with huge funeral games, the best that have ever been. And this is the ancient art, by the way, that I mentioned. Please keep in mind that this is Patroclus on the left, and he's got a beard, and Achilles on the right. He's looking younger and without a beard. That's going to be relevant in our future discussion, so I might call back to that. So after Patroclus dies, these are some of Achilles' reaction. He says he has no reason to live, threatens suicide. He sleeps lying down on his corpse, refuses to bury him until the ghost of Patroclus has come back and says, stop, this is too much. Oops. This is too much. This is wrong. You need to bury me. You need to let me go. And then, like I said, their ashes are going to be mingled together. So all these strong reactions and behaviors from Achilles indicate that their relationship is probably the key relationship to their life. And from the myth, we go into historical characters. Alexander the Great and his companion Hephaestion also grew up together, and they modeled their relationship explicitly and intentionally to the relationship of Achilles and Patroclus. So the Greeks themselves, when they reflect on their myths and see these couplings and these relationships, they see a mirror of what is in their own practices. So Alexander the Great had such a huge influence on world history and expanding Greek cultures to a wider part of the world, getting all the way to Egypt and all the way to India. By the age of 30, he had established one of the largest empires in history, undefeated in battle and considered pretty much by everyone a brilliant military commander. And clearly he identifies with Achilles, the great warrior, the driven sort of conquering type. And Hephaestion, again, is one of the prominent companions in his personal bodyguards of other companions that he grew up with, some of them that he'd been knowing since boyhood. So they're his kind of entourage, his closest men. And he is described by historians as by far the dearest of all the king's friends. He'd been brought up with Alexander, shared all his secrets. Again, he was trusted over and over by Alexander. And Alexander even slept with the Iliad under his pillow. So we know that he really admired Achilles, wanted to be Achilles a little bit. And he really saw Hephaestion as his Patroclus. So we see these cultural models being sort of looked up to in the lives of real people that existed historically. And they even go visit and make sacrifices on the shared tomb of Achilles and Patroclus. When in Alexander's campaigns he goes by Troy, he makes a stop specifically for that, to honor them. Expanding to other myths, talking a bit more about gender roles, I'm going to present a myth of sort of a woman that was different from the expected standard of women. We have a couple of those. So her father abandoned her Atalanta when she was not a boy. Oh well. She was left in a wood and raised by a bear. And then later the goddess Artemis raised her as part of her huntresses. Yeah, so Atalanta became an excellent hunter and later went on to many quests. Notably, she shot the arrow that brought down the Caledonian boar, which was a monster released by Artemis herself to punish a king who had not toasted at the right time to her name. Clearly, terrible mistake. So not only she brought down this Caledonian boar, but in a version of the myth of the Argonauts, she sailed, the only woman in the Argonauts ship, to get the Golden Fleece. Unfortunately, other versions of the myth cut her out of it because they say, she would have been too much of a problem on board. So we can see actually expectations of women being so strong that they actually changed the myths to exclude Atalanta in some versions. And this is the first part of her story. The second part of her story was when she gets married. So she does eventually reconcile with her father. When her father sees what a hero she's become, he's like, okay, fine, I can actually call you my daughter. I guess good enough. But he was like, no, you have to get married. This is not on, you can't stay unmarried, not a thing. And she said, well, if I have to get married, might as well be someone who runs faster than me. Impossible. So she was never defeated until, there's the several versions. This guy Hippomene comes along who's pretty handsome, and she maybe falls in love with him, or he's helped by Aphrodite, which is kind of a way of saying that he's helped by love to kind of conquer her. So he gets these 3 golden apples that he throws to her during the race. She stops to pick up the apples, and eventually she's just behind him. So technically he wins, and they end up getting married. And they love each other so much that they can't keep their hands off each other, to the point that Aphrodite, they get punished and turn into bears again to run off into the woods just by themselves. So she's kind of a bit of a wild woman. Atalanta is raised in the forest and kind of going back to it at the end. Then another story of sort of women who don't necessarily fit into the the role women were expected to fill. We got Iphis, again raised as a boy, this time because her family was too poor to afford to give the dowry, so they couldn't afford to get her to marry. So they raised her as a boy, solution found. But unfortunately, when they arrange the marriage, Iphis starts getting more and more anxious, like, what am I going to do? My wife expects me to be a man. I've grown up as a man, but I can't be a husband to her. So she keeps praying to the goddess Isis to turn him into a man, and Isis says, okay. So she does, and that way Iphis happily lives with his wife now, Ianthe. So you have a situation of magical gender changing, where Iphis really, really, really wants to be a man, and the gods grant it as a reward, and they can be together. We can say maybe here is it the societal expectation that 2 women can't be married, and therefore we create this story where they can be together, but only if one of them becomes a man? Or we could see this as this is what Iphis has always wanted to be, and the gods, because he prays, they listen to him and they grant the wish. You can read myths can always be read multiple ways, and they speak to us in different ways at different points in time as well. But it's definitely a peculiar story. And one more story about gender, Tiresias. This story also has 2 parts. So when he was young, Tiresias was walking in the woods and saw 2 snakes who were coupling and all entwined together. And he beats them with a stick to separate them, maybe. And Hera doesn't like it. Tiresias gets punished, turns into a woman, and becomes a priestess of Hera. She gets married, she has a daughter. The whole thing lives for 7 years as a woman, yeah? And then an older Tiresias sees again 2 snakes in the woods entwined. And there's 2 versions of the story. I put this one where she just leaves them alone, or there's another version where she hits them again. There's 2 versions, literally opposite of each other. But whatever she does, it's the right thing, apparently, because she gets turned into a man again. And at this point, Hera and Zeus are having an argument because Zeus has so many affairs with so many women, yeah, and Hera is really angry. And Zeus keeps saying, no, I have to have so many affairs because actually men get less pleasure from sex. And Hera's like, that sounds false and like an excuse. So they have a bet between them and they ask the only human who has been both and can judge. And they ask which pleasure is the greatest. And Tiresias answers that a woman's pleasure was 10 times better. And Hera is really angry. So she makes him blind. But Zeus is really happy. So she gives Tiresias the gift of prophecy. So Tiresias becomes this kind of boundary figure where the fact that he's been a woman and a man kind of gives him greater insight, and he becomes this kind of prophetic figure that gets always consulted by heroes and in different stories. And actually he lives a really long life, and even after he's dead, we got Odysseus consulting him in the underworld, because his knowledge and his insight of the future continues even after his death. And part of it seems to be related to the fact that he's been able to live 2 lives and experience mortal lives from both sides. So we can see that in their cultural stories, the Greeks reflect on sort of gender, love, where love pulls you, what relationship can create as a consequence, can be created as a consequence of this attraction. Now we're going to be talking a bit more in the historical part. So from the myth, we're going to go more into history and analyzing a specific society and this is Athens around the 5th century BC, because this is where we have a lot of sources. And specifically, Plato is the source that I'm going to be discussing the most because of just the amount of work we have. And we basically have a lot of documentations about this historical period in Athens. So I'm going to begin by talking about relationships between men, because that's the most documented type of homosexual relationships in our sources, because, well, most writers were men, and Athenian society was segregated by gender most of the time. So men would socialize with men, women socializing with women, more broadly most of the time, except, some religious festival, funerals, family occasions, but a lot of the society events would be separated. So, and just generally, women's stories were not considered as important by men. And the ancient Greek and Roman society were clearly male preferring and putting women most of the time in a sort of a lower category, so less interesting for them to talk about. So that is a long way to say we have more sources about this type of relationship. And what we noticed just from this piece of art, which represents 2 men sharing a couch at a drinking party, this man is holding a lyre, which is a symbol of the fact that there was a lot of music, a lot of sometimes dancing, reciting of poetry to music in this type of party. They're also wearing party crowns, with leaves. And we notice a very common thing in these pairings. There's always a younger man without a beard and an older man with a beard, so a grown adult man. So this would be in the dynamic of this type of relationship, the beloved being younger, while the lover was represented with a beard to signal his older age. So a bit of a content warning, we're going to be discussing these age gap relationships, which present, while they were part of the expected social structure of Athens, they did present an imbalance of power where the older partner was by design more experienced and older in years, even in his 30s, compared to the younger partner, who would have been sort of late teenage years, so 18 or slightly under. Okay, that's why I'm just letting you know. So again, going back to our expectations, this is a very broad summary, but what matters maybe more to what we tend to distinguish in categories of sexual identities might be if we're attracted to one gender or multiple gender or the same or the opposite gender. While for ancient Greece and Rome, first of all, this discussion of sexuality applies to men only, because women were expected to marry who they were arranged to marry. I would, again, it's a generalization, but most of the time, marry who they were instructed to marry and remain faithful to avoid, because that was the way to preserve the family line. And otherwise, there was, our male writers did not seem to think too hard about female sexuality. Let's put it that way. In ancient Greece and Rome, for a man's sexuality, the important distinction was passive or active. Okay, adult free men were expected to be the active partner, while women, boys, and slaves, yeah, we're talking about free men as opposed to enslaved people, women, boys, and slaves, because of that position of less power in society, they were expected to potentially also be mainly passive. Again, the moral expectation that, again, a generalization, but that we might have, that most people are heterosexual, and maybe an expectation towards keeping, how do you say, to not stray in the marriage. There in Rome and Greece, it was kind of assumed that, yes, a man, even after married, might have loves and other sexual partners. That is not to say that women didn't do that. But it's just we have less, when we have testimonies of this and sources that talk about this, usually the woman is heavily criticized and vilified, and it's usually used as something to attack her. So we have a less full picture of what was going on there. And we might have this ideal of love where if you love a person really very, very much, you want to get married to them. But marriage while it did contain inevitably a sexual element, it was mainly something about creating social bonds with the right family and creating the right descendancy for your family. While love was something that could, while it could happen in marriage, it would have been more, love was viewed as a very sort of random outside force that could not really be resisted. So it could happen in your marriage, but that would have been just a random. It could happen with anyone that the god of love decided to, draw you towards. So I'm now going for this part. I'm going to draw heavily on this essay by Eva Cantarella, which I really recommend, Bisexuality in the Ancient World, and I'm going to present sort of some highlights of her analysis of what perception the Greeks and Romans had of their sexuality and what kind of relationships they formed. So again, she's questioning here the use of the terms homosexuality and heterosexuality. They are modern words for our modern concept of sexuality. The Greeks and Romans, they didn't associate their sexual behavior with an identity. So loving another man, it was not linked to, it was not, first of all, it was not falling outside the norm. It did not preclude falling in love with women at another time or at the same time. And it was just one part of the experience of life. You might have many love stories and many relationships that would, sometimes be that would, they would not be limit. Basically, they will not limit your choice of partners in the future. Yeah, they were not seen as in conflict. Basically, loving a man and loving a woman was not seen as either or, but both could happen at different times or at different moments. And so the more important contrast and distinction that they cared about in their writings, and that is clear, is the active-passive contrast, like we discussed. And in fact, we know this sometimes from comic poetry or insult poetry, which is a thing in the ancient world, where one of the things that you could insult your rivals about is, for example, accusing them of being the passive partner in a homosexual relationship. So this is to say that clearly presents to us that they consider that to be sort of dishonorable, which again doesn't mean that people didn't form relationship a certain way, but just what the social it informs us on the social judgment of this type of relationship. So there's many, Eva Cantarella goes through the hypothesis about why did Greek culture specifically develop this structure of homosexual relationship between two men with a younger one and an older one. And one of the hypotheses is potentially the idea of rites of initiation. Marriage itself is in its own way, a rite of initiation, and it kind of changes your life. It's the start of a new chapter in your life where it's going to look very different from what you used to do as a child. So she's discussing the fact that, again, marriage is not the main place where love happens. Yeah, and while there is a minimum, like she says, a minimum of sexual desire involved in marriage for procreation, but it's more a social and economical institution. It's more about property and families and bloodlines than it is about your personal feelings. So she, on the theme of rites of initiation, Cantarella basically rejects the criticism that's linking the homosexuality in Greece strictly to initiation and removing any possibility of sexual desire between male partners. Another hypothesis that she rejects is the fact that Greek men had these homosexual relationships because women were excluded, like we said, from large aspects of social life. They couldn't, no women in the army, no women in the exercising area, no women in the drinking parties. Some Roman women did attend the drinking parties, but usually there was a part of the drinking parties where the women of good family were made to sort of leave. So this theory was mainly presented by this theory was mainly defended by Cohen. This idea that basically men could only seek courtship of other men because that would be the only type of people that would match them intellectually, that would have similar life experiences, that they could relate to, while they couldn't relate to women having such vastly different life experiences from them. But some evidence is that there was a lot of anxiety around male courtship in Athens, where there's a lot of in Plato's dialogues and in other sources, there's a lot of discussion about what's appropriate to do, what's inappropriate to do because of the age gap. They were aware of it, and they knew that, below a certain age, it would have been something that could turn, that would have been basically taking advantage of the younger partner. So there was a lot of anxiety around this. So Cohen basically discussed, well, they would not have engaged in it if they didn't have to. But Cantarella criticizes this idea that Greeks had homosexual relations because they had to, because they had this social expectation, because this type of relationship, actually, she proves in her essay, predates the exclusion of women from social life, and other areas of ancient Greece that did not segregate women also practice pederasty, as in, this is the technical term for the relationships between an older man and a younger youth. So we move on to discuss this specifically from the source she mainly analyzes, Plato. Well, I've reported the parts where she analyzes Plato, who discusses the differences between heavenly Aphrodite of the sky, and the common Pandemos Aphrodite. So, and obviously this is the one that Plato presents as appropriate and correct. It's the stable, committed love that is not concerned with bodily pleasure, and it's directed at boys who have reached the age of reason. While this common Aphrodite, who loves the body more than the soul, is kind of lusting after men and women indiscriminately. So Apais or Eromenos was supposed to resist the advances of the lover and test them to see if their true intentions were good and honorable, as opposed to dishonorable and just after bodily pleasure. So there was, Plato is one of the writers that has most discussed and the sort of etiquette around courtship between men in Athens, which is why we use him as a source. This is what Cantarella says about this. Paying court to boys is not evil in itself. It becomes evil only if the courtship is inspired by purely physical desire. And if you observe these rules of courtship, you guarantee the goodness of the sentiment. So, and she also points out that it would be really strange for Greek culture to come out with this this longing that is impossible to fulfill. That it seems a bit of an absurd system from her point of view. That you'd have a whole system of rules that would prevent the beloved, the eromenos, the beloved, from ever accepting the relationship and yielding honorably. So they did need a way to accept the attention and the love of the lover without being dishonored. And it seems that the way towards that direction was mainly being concerning and being, how do you say, sorry, not concerning, discerning about their choice. Basically, choosing a partner that they thought would that would stick with them, that would be committed to them, and would actually love them for themselves, and not just for bodily pleasures. So, and she's talking about the appropriate age to start to initiate this type of relationship. There's these verbs that are used in Greek. So younger boys are described as aphron. Everyone is born aphron, incapable of reason. But the young male at the age of 18 or 20 starts to reason. So he starts to phronein. They start to think properly. In other words, they are mature enough to distinguish between right and wrong, and to engage in this type of relationships with the more mature attitude, if that makes sense. So and when we talk about social expectation, there was definitely the expectation that there was an age where it was your role to be the object of love and being the beloved. And then there wasn't, you grew, you did your military service, you grew into an adult man, and then it came the age where you were the one who were the lover, and your attraction was expected to direct itself towards younger boys of the age where they were of the age of receiving love. So again, as Cantarella puts it, the attaining adult status meant this change in your sexual role from the passive to the active. And we're not talking simply about bodily functions, but I just like the attitude in the relationship would have been the more sort of receiving the attentions and responding to the lover, as opposed to being the one putting things forward, putting your attentions forward, presenting your beloved with signs of love. And basically, when we talk about passive or active, it's not just a sexual act, but it's about the whole attitude in the relationship. So clearly this passage doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't happen in a minute. It's a process that, growing into an adult, brings on a different attitude to sexual life as well. So again, and she's again reiterating that the dichotomy that the Greeks and the Romans were interested in is active and passive, and where the adult male free man, the adult free male would have to take that active role. What happens if you don't? What happens if you maintain your attraction to different people? What happens if some of these relationships that are formed when one of the partners is younger continues to endure in the years? That is not always expected, but it did happen. So just because these are the rules and these are the expectation, people will be people, and it is not necessarily, this does not necessarily describe all of the sexuality of Greek men. So again, the discussion of the age is very important to Plato, clearly. And again, this transition from being expected to be the beloved and the lover is definitely a process that lasts the years. And these years between 15 and 25 is kind of the age where the young men, the Nianiskoi, are kind of a bit potentially indetermined, potentially irresponsible, unreasonable. So again, good lovers start happening after this transition period has ended. And that's why the lover used to be usually older than the age of 25. When also people started to be expected to marry. Yeah, well, people, I say, men in Athens were expected to marry. So, oh, I feel like, yes, that's fine. So, thinking back of not Apollo, sorry, Patroclus and Achilles, can we remember which one was the bearded one? Patroclus was the older bearded partner. And yet, who was the dominant, aggressive? Achilles. Right. So the Greeks themselves looked at this relationship and went, but wait, I thought we were supposed to not be that way. And yet, as you can see, the sort of reality of human experience is more varied than what is structured and codified in even in ancient society. An example of the concept of male couples with an older and younger partner taken to a very, from a certain point of view, successful realization is the Sacred Band of Thebes. So again, this is a passage of Plato's Symposium that might as well describe the Sacred Band of Thebes. So he talks about this ideal: what if a state or an army should be made up of lovers and their beloved? They'd be the very best governor of their city, abstaining from all dishonor and emulating one another in honor. And when fighting at each other's side, although a mere handful, they would overcome the world. For what lover would not choose rather to be seen by all mankind than by his beloved, either when abandoning his post or throwing away his arms? He would be ready to die 1,000 deaths rather than endure this. Or who would desert his beloved or fail him in the hour of danger? That's the theory, and the practice is that in Thebes, as an institution, they had an army of 300 men, selected only by skill and valor, and there were 150 couples of a lover and a beloved, and they stayed in service for an allotted amount of time, where they were maintained by the city, and it was one of the it was admired as one of the most invincible forces in the ancient world. They were defeated. They had their last stand against Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, who defeated them, and they are described by the historians as lying on top of each other, because they all died defending their beloved, and they were buried side by side, and their graves are marked by a colossal lion that has been reconstructed in modern times. So they found under the ground all these graves of that are side by side together, because that's where they all fell together. So as you can see, these type of relationships were meant to forge bonds that would inspire each other to be the best version of themselves, and to collectively then be the kind of an exemplar man and citizen for their city. Staying with Plato, I wanted to get into the myth of the origin of love, which is that funny creature right there is the original people. This is a myth told by Aristophanes the comedian in Plato's Symposium. I think it's the best part of the whole dialogue. And this is I'm going to play a song and you can read that. Let's hope the song plays properly, she says. Oh dear. Here we go. Three times. So yeah, in this myth, we used to be one creature and got split into two parts, and that kind of is the mythical origin. Well, this is a myth invented by a writer, so it's not a traditional myth, but it's a kind of a newer myth in Athens. And they have these three types, right? The three types of attraction towards opposite genders, or women for women, or men for men, which Plato says this is the best. These people are the best of boys and youth because they have the more manly nature, the men attracted to men, the manliest you can get. Which again just goes to show maybe how our categories are a bit different. Sorry, that's just a quirk. And there's this really beautiful description of the attraction, the fact that when these two halves find each other, they're kind of in amazement, yeah, of their love and friendship and intimacy, and they are people who pass their whole lives together, and yet they cannot explain what they want from one another, but they just want to be the same person again, because that's what we used to be. And exceptionally, we say these words have a wider application. They include men and women everywhere. And I believe if our loves were perfectly accomplished and each one returning to his primeval nature had his original true love, then our race would be happy. But we can't be happy because we can't become that whole person again. So the best thing we can do is have a congenial love that matches us, and that hopefully you can be with them as much as you can, although you can't be the same person anymore. So I thought that's quite an interesting way of, this is how Plato has described in his time the different attraction that he has seen, and it's one of the few times where women are also in the equation. Speaking of which, we're going to go a bit backwards in time, actually, to one of the greatest poets. I'm not even going to say poetess, one of the greatest poets of Greek literature, Sappho. She lived in Lesbos, that island that is almost nearer to Turkey than it is Greece. So right here, that's Athens. So we skipped all the way to Asia Minor. We don't have ancient images of Sappho, zero. So I'm going to analyze more modern representations of her. The fact that she's got in this statue, the hand grasping the breast is like a symbol of the torture of love that she expresses in her poetry. And we got almost abandoned to the side because she's so empowered by the emotions. We got the laurel wreath and the lyre as a symbol of her poetic achievements. So again, she's got a lot of Eastern influence in her poetry. So she was a composer of lyric poetry, so sung with a lyre. And lyric poetry is one of the first times in Greek literature where we have personal themes as opposed to epic, big battles where the poet is not really an I, it's more a narrator in the background. It's the only ancient literary expression of women loving women. Her relationships were set in this theasos, this all-female community where unmarried girls, this is before Plato, so this is an archaic Greek society, different from what it would become in Athens. It is clear that the point of these communities was to prepare girls, to give them an education in music, singing, dancing, and forming bonds before marriage. They would then take off and be married wherever the families destined them to. So there's a few poems where we feel the pain of that separation. It's been debated. Sappho's poetry is quite explicit. It's been previously debated whether she really meant to have sex with other women. But I mean, Philomovitz tried to argue there was a desire to sleep, but the language and the imagery is very much the language of desire. And I feel like it could not be more explicit. We'll get to some examples later. So another representation of her, fancy clothes. One of the values exalted in her poetry was the love for luxury and beautiful things in all things, the love for grace, culture, beauty, the arts. So, she kind of does some poems where she despises people who, have no appreciation for culture and beautiful things. Bit exotic, yeah, like we said, she was very close to more the eastern part of the Greek sort of world. And the statue of Homer, because as a symbol of her place, she was called a female Homer sometimes to say how great her poetry was. And here is Sappho represented with her students. Flower garlands often mentioned in Sappho's poem. Names of other women. Attis is mentioned as one of the women beloved in her poems. Again, here, Anactoria, another one. And this is Sappho's poetic rival, a man also from Lesbos, a contemporary poet. Some people have imagined them in a relationship together, but that is complete fantasy. Like many things about Sappho's life, like she committed suicide after being rejected by a younger man, completely made up many centuries after her death. Her husband was named by our sources Kerkylas of Andros, which means penis of Men Island, which is clearly a joke name, so clearly made up. Again, this is a later source of this fantastical relationship with a man that she committed suicide over. And early translations of Sappho actually sometimes change the pronouns in her poems to make the love heterosexual, change sometimes the pronouns or the endings of the words, because, well, sometimes they did it sometimes it might have been to hide it, but sometimes it might have been generally like, oh, how is it possible? Must be a mistake, and covering it up. So this is probably her longest poem that survives. I'm aware we have very little time, but I am racing to a conclusion. Ode to Aphrodite. So Sappho has been rejected in love, and so she invokes here the immortal Aphrodite. This I pray, don't crush my heart with pains and sorrows. But come here, if I ever before, when you heard my far-off cry, you listened. And you came, leaving your father's house, you in your chariot of gold. The beautiful swift sparrows led you over the black earth, from the sky through the middle air, whirling their wings into a blur. Rapidly they came, and you, blessed goddess, smile on your immortal face, asked, what has happened this time? Why did I call again? And what did I especially desire for myself and my frenzied heart? Who this time am I to persuade to your love? Sappho, who is doing you wrong? For even if she flees, soon she shall pursue, and even if she refuses gifts, soon she shall give them. If she doesn't love you, soon she shall love you, even if she's unwilling. Come to me now, once again, release me from grueling anxiety, all that my heart longs for fulfill, and be yourself my ally in love's battle. So this is not the first time Sappho's called the goddess. They got this personal relationship where every time she has a bad time with her crushes, she comes to her help. And look at this Greek conception of love. She will love you even unwilling. Love as an outside force that drags us where it wants us, and we kind of have very little choice about it. Also look at the balance of power in the relationship, where there's always someone, often in Greek representations of love, there's a pursuer and someone who is being pursued. I would say it's very typical that there's someone who loves more strongly and therefore is the one that has to give gifts and convince the other. This kind of a bit of a statement from Sappho where she says, some say an army of horsemen, some of foot soldiers, some of ships is the fairest thing on the black earth. This would be epic poetry, wars, soldiers, But I say the most beautiful thing is what one loves. And then she gives the example of Helen, who sailed to Troy. So she goes to the Trojan War, which is the Homeric example, but she actually focuses on Helen choosing love instead of her child, her husband, everything she should have wanted. And I would much prefer to see the lovely way she walks and the radiant glance of her face than the war chariots of the Lydians or their foot soldiers in arms. Yeah, we come back, the ending comes back to the beginning with this idea that your love, the woman you love, Anactoria, she's named here, is more beautiful than, an army going to war. And that is a bit of a revolutionary statement. It's kind of unique in its view. This is the Ode to Jealousy, which is very famous. It's been copied also by Roman poets, copied in a good way, as in this was the model for other poems to come. When it says your sweet voice and your enticing laughter, in Greek, these are female participles. So that's the only way that in this poem we know that this is addressed to a woman. Otherwise we wouldn't. And apparently this woman is talking to a man, might be the future fiance, future boyfriend, and Sappho can't do anything but look, suffering inside. My tongue is frozen in silence. Instantly a delicate flame runs beneath my skin. With my eyes I see nothing. My ears make a whirring noise. She's just frozen and paralyzed by the power of the sentiment. So this is one of the goodbyes, and it's also going to be our goodbye because of the time. Um, this is a confession. This is called Sappho's confession most often. Uh, I just really want to die. That's a fragment, and then the poem continues. She, crying many tears, left me and said to me, "How terribly we have suffered, we too. I really don't want to go away." But she says, "Go and be happy, remembering me." And she mentions the violets, the roses, the crocuses. This becomes really fragmented. Most of her poems are preserved on papyri, which have holes in them. So these are the holes. So this imagery of flowers, which is often associated with love, and you anointed yourself with royal something perfumes, probably, and on soft beds, you're tender, satisfied your desire. So the imagery and the shared good moments that kind of are remembered in the moment of separation, which is sort of inevitable because of the life. So yeah, we'll leave you with some fragments of Sappho just there on the board. Thank you for listening, and if you want to do any further reading, these are the texts that I mainly discussed today. But I hope it's been a bit of a flying visit, but I hope you found something of interest. And yeah, thank you so much. I promised questions, but we are really running late on time, but do get back to us. Bye. I'm going to close hopefully. Don't worry. I'm going to need to faff for a minute if you want to start maybe getting things together. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Fantastic. That was very interesting. Right. Master's classroom as well. So you can
Yes.